We're continuing on chapter 23 of Barry and the Boys, the CIA, the Mob, and America's Secret History by Daniel Hopsicker. That covert op, the covert op that ate the world. How Barry Seal went from being, at the dawn of the 1980s, a talented amateur in the drug smuggling business to just a year later heading a paramilitary organization with almost 100 employees on two continents has never before been told. Like with the earlier meteoric rise of Alberto Silesia Falcon, these are secrets the CIA is loath to have escape. And while the effects of SEAL's historic smuggling operation have been chronicled and the relationships involved hinted at, there remain today huge questions about just who really benefited from the massive drug smuggling which took place using the Mina airport. SEAL, by the end of 1982, commanded an organization with a reach spanning the Western Hemisphere. Did he do this alone? Get there all by himself? Of course not. We recalled the four essentials that SEAL had needed to make it all work. Every successful drug smuggling organization needs four things. Miami Private Eye Gary McDaniel had said, tickling them off on his fingers: production, distribution, and transportation, and protection. What organization had provided the protection? And what was the relationship between the hundreds of millions of dollars generated by SEAL's smuggling and the simultaneous documented infusions of vast sums into the Arkansas's bond market? Had Barry Seal been making cash and then turning it over to Dan Lasseter to be launched? We recalled the famous exchange between then Governor Clinton and horrified State Trooper L.D. Brown, who confronted his boss after flying with SEAL at Mina and discovering the cocaine importation. Clinton waved Brown's concerns off. "That's Lasseter's deal," Brown quotes him saying, "and your buddy Bush knows all about it." But where did Bill Clinton fit in? He had to have been informed of the operation at a bare minimum. Arkansas is just too small a state to conceal major infusions of men and material. But was he a part of the operation? Had Arkansas's Governor Bill Clinton helped to provide the protection? Of course he had, but no one has been willing to give direct testimony to their relationship. Until, that is, we met James Miller, the pilot and SEAL associate arrested with Barry in the 72 explosive bust. Surprisingly, he later went to work flying for the DEA out of Baton Rouge office. There, Miller heard all the latest news about the hottest topic of conversation there, Barry Seal. One time, one of the local DEA agents had told me that Barry had been arrested in Mina, Arkansas, and I ran into Barry a week or two later at a pay telephone, and we were talking, and Barry said, "Let me show you something." And he showed me a piece of paper, Miller continued, a personal release bond, a piece of paper that somebody has to sign before you can get out of jail, signed by Bill Clinton, who at that time was Attorney General of the state of Arkansas. Miller smiles wryly, and that's when I began to realize that Barry was pretty heavily politically connected. Had Bill Clinton and Barry Seal both worked for the same shadowy organization? Would the hidden connections along the subject of speculation between Barry's smuggling in Arkansas and other well-known Arkansas players ever become visible? With, for example, shadowy Arkansas's governor power broker Jackson Stevens, the biggest contributor to the first George Bush in 1988 and then Bill Clinton in 1992? Or Chicken King Tyson, his attorney Jim Blair? Had all these figures stood idly by and watched as SEAL used their smaller state to build an empire? Here was the Holy Grail in our Mina quest. Who was Barry Seal working for? The Mina scandal had been, much like the Kennedy assassination, a frustrating preoccupation of conspiracy theorists. But no Grail quest is easy. The Mafia has the code of Omerta, their blood-curdling code of silence, and the good old boy and girl Arkansas elite can also rely on its members to keep their mouths shut. Though through use of everything from swampy graves to concrete coffins underneath highway pylons, to the spray of automatic weapons fire like that which felled Clinton bodyguard Jerry Parks, who reportedly had been on many cash runs to Mina with the also now very dead Vince Foster. Less dramatically, group disloyalty in Arkansas is also punished by social ostracism, being denied access to back-scratching deal-making network that controls the scams. But late in our investigation, we met a man no longer worried about falling from favor. The reason? He already had. His nickname in the SEAL organization was Blackie, and he had been Barry's money man in Miami. Numerous sources confirmed his close connection with SEAL's organization, including SEAL's widow, with whom Blackie maintained a friendship even after SEAL died. We saw, for example, a condolence card he wrote her after SEAL's assassination. Blackie, who hails from rural Arkansas, is today a talented 50-ish legitimate businessman who paid a price for his illegal activities in the 1980s, spending almost a year in solitary confinement in a tiny county jail in rural Florida, and then 6 years in a federal penitentiary after being caught up in the DEA undercover effort called Operation Screamer, which also rolled up Barry Seal. He told us, a man who had helped put Seal in touch with the other Arkansas players. Blackie first met Barry through two college chums of his in law school and LSU in Baton Rouge, Joseph Beaver Brantley IV and Michael Roy Fugler, are two exceptionally interesting individuals, we were to learn. Lawyer Fugler had been deeply involved in Barry's sign companies as well as his various smuggling enterprises, and Blackie's other chum, lawyer Beaver Brantley, has been a part of some spectacularly shady enterprises with Edwin Edwards' son, Stephen Edwards, to give just one example, where he participated in a $100 million bust-out of an emergency company. Money in a publicly traded energy natch company was made to just disappear. To stockholder dismay, like Barry Seal's arrest disappeared or the government's files on David Ferry had disappeared. Spooks are just called spooks because things and sometimes people disappear with almost magical frequency around them. Didn't know that. Makes sense. I became acquainted with Barry in the 74-75 time period. Blackie related, through Beaver and Roy and my brother-in-law at the time, a banker from the little western Arkansas town of Helena named Baker Bush. We all got along well, partied and so on, just young men on the make, I guess you'd say. My brother-in-law, Baker Bush, had taken an interest in Barry's sign company, loaning him money to expand the business. Baker was in a wheelchair. I was married to his sister, who had just developed multiple sclerosis, so there was a lot going on. Then I lost track of Barry for a while, Blackie continues, and reestablishes contact by calling him up in 1980 to seek his advice about an airplane I was considering purchasing, a twin Bonanza. I was working up a load in a drug smuggling parlance, putting together the various elements that must mesh perfectly for a successful run to take place. Barry was a top pilot and an expert on planes. I had also by then heard that he enjoyed a certain level of protection. Blackie smiled. So I called him up. and we got to talking, and one thing led to another. At this point in late 1980 and early 1981, Barry, as we have seen, was a talented amateur smuggler, bringing back dope undercover of his real employment as a spook. Barry was working as a plane mover in 1980, Gary Hemming had said. What Blackie did next seems truly momentous today, if only in hindsight. He had heard, though, the Arkansas's grapevine. He had heard through the Arkansas's grapevine. He told us that Fayetteville attorney Jim Blair might be willing to entertain the idea of making a strictly off-the-books cash investment, a high-risk investment that would also have the advantage of being very high reward. I went to see him at his law office in Fayetteville, Blackie said. Jim's a tall guy, very smart, with a reputation for being highly analytical, which I remember thinking was a little strange because his desk was a complete mess and jumble of papers, really. When we were done cutting a deal, we had a plane and pilot Barry, and we did our first successful load together, and that's how Barry Seal met Jim Blair. We all knew at that point about Jim Blair that he was the guy who had turned Hillary Clinton's $3,000 commodities investment into $100,000, a matter of financial probity on which the press has been strangely willing to accord Hillary Clinton with her smug air of self-righteousness, the high ground. Most impartial observers who analyze the transaction conclude it was a straight bribe laundered through futures trading passed through Blair to Hillary by one Arkansas's leading industrial conglomerates. You and Barry went into business with the Jim Blair, we asked incredulously. Don Tyson's lawyer? The guy who turned $3,000 into $100,000 for Hillary Clinton, and no one can figure out how he had done it? Blackie grinned, knowing Barry might have helped. Ken Starr's Whitewater probe, for one brief flickering moment, turned to the subject of drug money and Clinton, looking into possible links between Clinton campaign finances and drug profits in Arkansas before slinking back into the safer precincts of the Oval Office blowjobs. Despite substantial evidence of wrongdoing, Starr's investigation was shut down, as all the other law enforcement probes had been, according to the disgusted law enforcement authorities who had been there. Starr's 4-year Arkansas probe wasn't even the first 4-year-long federal investigation shut down, an honor belonging to the FBI Organized Crime Drug Task Force looking into the Dan Lassiter drug trafficking organization between 1982 and 1986. Lassiter had been the focus of a major 4-year FBI probe investigation, usually reserved for outfits the size of the Teamsters. Gary Webb had made a big discovery about Lassiter, he told us, while doing research for his book Dark Alliance. In December 1986, he told us, the FBI's own report of the investigation began. The Little Rock, Arkansas office of the FBI concluded a 4-year organized crime drug task force investigation involving the cocaine trafficking activities of a prominent Little Rock businessman who operated several banking investment firms in Arkansas and Florida. The investigation revealed that the businessman was the main supplier of cocaine to the investment, banking, and bond community, the largest bond community in the United States outside of New York City. This task force resulted in the conviction of this businessman, a 24 co-defendants to jail sentences ranging from 4 months to 10 years, as well as the seizure of cocaine, marijuana, an automobile, and an airplane, and $77,000. Webb paused. Now, according to the FBI's own annual report to warrant an FBI organized crime drug task force, you must be a major regional drug trafficking organization with the following characteristics. 1. highly organized. 2. Multi-jurisdictional in operational scope. And 3. Possess national significance and influence. Does that sound like a guy who spent 6.5 months in a halfway house? The sentencing of Dan Lassiter is yet another vivid illustration that being connected means never having to say you're sorry. Lassiter got a slap on the wrist sentence, even though he was acknowledged to have been the drug kingpin. There were also even earlier examples of thwarted Arkansas's investigations, including federal and state undercover narcotics operations dating back to the mid-1970s targeting powerful Arkansas's poultry processor Don Tyson, the major target over a span of 10 years. But the bantam-sized magnate running Tyson Foods, the state's largest private employer, had fended them off with ease. Operating from an egg-shaped office in the company headquarters in Springdale, Tyson was, like Lassiter, a major contributor to Bill Clinton's campaigns, and like Lassiter was also alleged to be in the drug business. Memoranda circulated in the criminal intelligence section of the Arkansas State Police showed Tyson under suspicion of drug dealings as long ago as the early 1970s. The DEA had a file, Tyson Donald J. et al., including documents referring to the Donald Tyson's drug trafficking organization. A report commented that Tyson is an extremely wealthy man with much political influence and seems to be involved in almost every kind of shady operation, especially narcotics. However, he has to date gone without implication in any specific crime. Another file told of allegations by an informant that Tyson smuggles cocaine from Colombia, South America, inside racehorses to Hot Springs, Arkansas. Smuggling cocaine inside of racehorses? This, we think, is too arcane a concept to have sprung from two separate sources, unless it were true, because in addition to the Arkansas report, we also have the report of lawyer and author Richmond Odom, latest book Sold Out, who interviewed a woman named Frances living next door to Barry Seal's hideout in Livingston Parish between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Frances, also a pilot, had bought the place from Seal because it was adjacent to the landing strip Seal's after Barry landed the Fat Lady C-123 military cargo plane on the strip early one morning. She said a few minutes later she heard the neighing of horses. She went out on her sun deck, looked across the gravel road to the airstrip, and saw 5 or 6 horses grazing beside the plane. A few minutes later the horses were headed back into the plane, and it took off. This would seem to indicate one of two things. Either Chicken King Don Tyson and Barry Seal were in the smuggling business together, or each had independently come up with the novel idea of smuggling cocaine inside of racehorses. Then we remembered Jim Blair was Don Tyson's attorney, and then suddenly things cleared up just a little. We were able to immediately verify at least one thing we had heard from Blackie about Blair. He was, in fact, a slob. Jim Blair, the corporate counsel of Tyson Foods, keeps an admittedly messy desk at his office at Tyson Foods in Springdale, read a news article regaling an anecdote about a sheriff's deputy moonlighting as a security guard at Blair's law firm. The guard had once reported a break-in at the firm based on nothing but the state of Blair's apparently ransacked office. Cleanliness may be next to godliness, but it's nowhere near the real seat of power in American life these days, because Blair was a force to be reckoned with behind the Arkansas scene, turning up at crucial flashpoints in the Clinton history. It was a call from Blair that persuaded Webb Hubbell to resign as Associate Attorney General, a call from Blair that persuaded the late Jim McDougal to buy the Clintons out of the Whitewater Land Development Project in December 1992, a month after the presidential election. Even Vincent Foster, friend of Blair's and law partner of Hillary Clinton's, who brought the paper over to sign, was asked to wait outside so he wouldn't hear the details of that particular Blair Power phone call. But from that day forward, McDougal sharply curtailed his public grousing about the president. As corporate counsel for Tyson Foods, Blair executed the deals through which Don Tyson would build the largest poultry company and later negotiated the plea bargain that got Tyson and his company out of the Mike Epsy quagmire. As a political operative, he raised buckets of money for Democrats, then later got the Clintons out of the Whitewater Project, and it was Jim Blair who steered Hillary Rodham Clinton to her famous $100,000 killing in the commodities market, and then later advertised Bill Clinton and then later advised Bill Clinton on how to save his presidency. Jim Blair, it seemed obvious, was what's known in certain circles as a fixer. Those who know Blair hate that he's labeled a fixer, said one newspaper report, but they respect the power he's cultivated and are careful not to cross him. His regal congeniality has a sharp edge. It would be easy to mistake Jim Blair as a footnote in history, read another article. He has played his part mostly behind the backdrop. Tyson Foods Company history does not even mention his name. But people don't need to see Blair's name in the credits to know a call from him means that the big gun has been pulled out. Blair, it was said, pursued two passionate interests, the stock market and politics. His stock transactions were so profitable, they were said to have made him more money than his work with Tyson. He is also, of course, reported to have given away a few secrets to his closest pals, some of whom made a small fortune following his advice. Could this very public man be the Jim Blair who, according to Blackie, had financed the first load in what would become the biggest drug smuggling operation in American history? Was Blair really a boy genius, or was he, instead, just the latest Mafia and CIA-connected wonder-like wheeler and dealer Alan Glick, an ambulance-chasing Kansas City attorney who transmogrified overnight into the megabucks owner of several Las Vegas' biggest casinos, courtesy the Teamsters Central State Pension Fund, for whom he fronted? Speaking of the Teamsters, Barry Seal apparently made them a tidy profit too. I made a trip up to Des Plaines, Illinois once myself, Blackie coyly told us. This is where the Central States Teamsters Pension Fund is located, isn't it? Having friends in high places can be an enormous help if you're attempting to establish a reputation as a wheeler dealer. Being a stock market whiz would be a snap if you were getting inside tips from, say, former SEC Chairman Bill Casey, whose largesse extended to providing such information to New York mobsters of his acquaintance. But Blair and Seal had hooked up. Who had Blair's patron been? But I gotta read that again. But if Blair and Seal had hooked up, who had Blair's patron been? Of course, a case could always be made that he did it on his own, but if you've been to Arkansas, you likely would sooner believe that Lum and Abner were the true owners of the Federal Reserve, and that any of the characters from that benighted state made their pile without a big push from offstage. Also, the notion of Jim Blair as the secret Arkansas drug pen was absurd. It made far more sense that he would have reported to someone higher up. But who? Hadn't Starr's probe already gone over Arkansas with a fine-tooth comb? Wouldn't the national media, even if their coverage was blatantly censored, have snuck in a few clues to Mr. Big? But then, if the national press had been on top of things back when it counted, Clinton would today still be in Little Rock hosting governors' quality conferences, taking lunch meetings with big-haired state clerks in Excelsior suites. So we set about finding out for ourselves. That's it for today's chapter.